Shirley Ricks, thank you for joining us today. You have an illustrious career of editing, first off with FARMS, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, and then later for the Maxwell Institute, and now you edit for the Religious Studies Center at BYU. So a long career of editing, and as part of that, you were involved with editing Hugh Nibley in a lot of ways. Yeah. So with this volume, Hugh Nibley Observed, in what ways were you involved in preparing this book for publication?
Well, it started out as rather a mechanical task of going between authors and editors and typesetters, and I was just shifting files and making sure that things were happening. That was the start of it. And then Jeff Bradshaw said, well, you could do a lot here given your background with the Hugh Nibley works. Would you be interested in being a co-editor? I said, sure. So at that point, then the role became a little more intense, and I felt more invested in the project. I mean, it was all on a volunteer basis anyway, but I felt like I could have a greater say in the format of the book, the styles that we used, and I could give some suggestions about how we could make this compatible with the collected works, to look like it's a part of the tradition, the history of the collected works. So I did editing, I did proofreading, I helped with the indexing, and there were all sorts of roles that each of us took on, but I was involved in a lot of that.
That's great. And with the collected works of Hugh Nibley, 19-volume, massive collection of his books and his articles and his work over the years. How did you get involved with editing the collected works of Hugh Nibley back in, when was the project started?
Well, okay, I was not in on the beginning. Okay. So my husband actually was probably one of the earlier people who started source checking. And Stephen Ricks. Yes, and so Jack, he's a friend of Jack Welch, and when they were doing all of these volumes that they wanted to get out really quickly, they drafted anybody who was a willing volunteer. And given Stephen's background, he was just a right-on choice to be involved in the source checking and so forth. And I believe he edited one or two of the volumes as well. So he had the first entree into working on the collected works, and I was eventually pulled in to help do source checking. I was good at running around up and down stairs in the library and, helping to find sources and so forth. At some point in all of this, about '89, when I started working more hours and so forth for FARMS on a more regular basis and became one of their editors, then we were still working on these volumes. And so I would say about halfway through the collected works of Hugh Nibley, then I started working on the production end of the collected works. So I would help work with those who were producing the manuscripts, typing them up, preparing them, and then we, try to get the footnotes in shape. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, and getting them ready to send to Deseret Book.
Wonderful. In this volume, Hugh Nibley Observed, your chapter is on editing Hugh Nibley. And you talk about how when you first started working on the collected works of Hugh Nibley, you were involved in a lot of source checking and being fastidious about his many, many notes. Now, for a younger generation who exists well after the time, or for a generation unfamiliar with what it would be like to edit and typeset things before modern word processing and the internet, what are some of the skills that are required for this big endeavor?
Well, this is a really fascinating question. When I go back and think about what we were doing, many of these people were volunteers. Sometimes I think they would hire a student who had skills or something, but willing people, willing bodies who were willing to spend time in the library, going from shelf to shelf, pulling off books, looking up sources and saying, well, is it on this page? Is it in this volume and this issue and so forth, and finding it. I just recall, this is something that I don't even know if the libraries still own it anymore. Maybe it's hidden away. Great big green books. And these were the National Union Catalog. And inside of these books, they had copied the card catalogs of major universities throughout the United States, and they had put them in alphabetical order of the author, and they were just on the page, just cards from all sorts of libraries, And you would consult this to say, oh, this library has this source. And so not only did we use, of course, the BYU library, but many of the sources that Nibley had gone to belonged to other libraries. So Stephen and I enjoyed traveling to libraries.
Wow.
And checking out sources in Northern and Southern California, in Chicago. There were these huge Egyptological books that would not fit on a copy machine. So I would take pictures of the pages, the relevant pages. So we got to where we could, you know, figure out where things were. And this is probably as good a point as any to say that if we found the book that Nibley had used, we felt very fortunate. We said, this is the book he used. And the way we could identify that were his pencil marks.
Oh, wow.
Because he would write in library books, which of course we cannot do these days, but we'd say, oh yes, Nibley was here. This is the book, this is the source he was citing.
It's almost like an archaeologist looking for the clues of
yes.
antiquity.
Yeah, there was, for example, one instance where the source checkers were just unable to match up the page numbers and everything with the sources he was giving. It was a lot of science fiction stories. Well, they finally found an anthology that had all the sources in with the right page numbers. So obviously he had, you know, used this source because there were his marks. So we had, you know, my husband's phenomenal memory of call numbers and where books are located. He'd say, go up to the third floor, you know, this shelf and whatever, and then pull it off. And John Gee's talent in languages, foreign languages that we needed to use, they were all just wonderful helpers. And we had a group that we called the Collected Workers of Hugh Nibley. We wore T-shirts.
Oh, wow.
We had a good time.
That's charming. And, you know, some of us with the hubris of youth sometimes think, oh, things are so much easier and better now with word processing and with InDesign and all these tools. But, you know, you mentioned traveling to all these libraries because there's no other way to do it. That certainly sounds better to me. I mean, that's what a nice perk.
We did enjoy that. Yeah.
What was your favorite part of editing Hugh Nibley over the course of your time?
I think finally seeing a book come out and to see that all of our hours of labor and diligence and our efforts to make it as perfect as we could resulted in a wonderful book that people would enjoy looking at and reading and using. I did also enjoy the challenge of preparing the files and making sure that if there was a second citation needed after a first citation, that it was in the right format. That's just something that I enjoy doing, a lot of detailed things. So it was a good process. I would say it was difficult at times to edit some of his material, in particular if it was from a speech, an oral presentation, because he would flit from topic to topic, and there were probably no prepared footnotes for his remarks. So we were in the position of having to try to manufacture and find, well, where did this come from? You know,
Oh, wow. So you had to
we
create
had
the
to
sources
we had
for
to
him.
create the sources. He might have said so and so, you know, given a name of an individual. So we had that heads up.
Yeah.
So those were harder to edit. But if he had written something, his prose was so elegant and beautiful and styled. We really didn't have to do a lot with his prose, his language. It was the speeches that were a little more challenging.
Sure. And that connects nicely with my next question. So today, when we approach Hugh Nibley, sometimes people will be in the habit of saying, well, you know, Hugh Nibley's dated, and so it's not as reliable, his work. And sure, that's a fair critique because a lot of scholarship has come out since his day. But another critique would be that, oh, his footnotes were a mess, or he wasn't always precise in his footnotes. But as someone who worked so closely and intimately with those sources, what do you think of his footnotes? Was it a nightmare to verify his sources? Did he make stuff up out of whole cloth, or was he generally reliable?
It's an excellent question and one that's been bandied about. But I can say, from my experience and those who have worked on this project, that he did not make up things. They were there. Sometimes they were a little harder to find. We found that a high percentage of his footnotes were easy to find and therefore didn't take a lot of time, but it was those recalcitrant ones that maybe there was a page number wrong or something had been transposed. We remember he didn't have copy machines. He didn't have the internet. He was doing this on 3x5 cards.
It's remarkable.
And so the fact that he even had the information and then probably had it in his head as well was totally amazing. So the difficult ones took longer to solve just because something was a little bit wrong here and there. But everyone who worked on the project came to the conclusion that, yes, he may have been sloppy. And I tell you, as an editor, I have worked with sloppy authors. And I know what it's like. And when I get a good author, I say, oh, good, I can work through this one. And the footnotes are right. They're in good shape and so forth. So, yes, he was a little bit sloppy, but they were always there when we could finally identify it. We'd say, oh, that's what he was meaning, or that's what this little number means. Sometimes he would put a title maybe without an author. And so that was a little trickier to kind of find that particular article that he'd referred to. But ultimately, most of the time, we were able to come up with it. And we were always in awe at his mind and his memory and his ability to bring it all together.
In your chapter, you talked about in your endless quest to find sources and to verify his footnotes, you sometimes had to go to his house to ask him for things. What was it like visiting with Phyllis and Hugh in their home?
Well, I just have fond memories of going to the Nibley home, this little greenhouse on 700 North that is no longer there, made way for condos. Phyllis was always in her favorite chair. So as you come in the door, you could see Phyllis sitting in her chair, surrounded with books and maybe a yarn work or something. And then as we got into the living room, this narrow, long living room, Hugh's chair was always opposite Phyllis. So he was not facing the door, he was facing Phyllis. And we would go sit on a couch and, you know, where we could kind of see both of them. Stephen and I often went together. We tried not to overstay our welcome because Nibley was always on to his next project. He always wanted to be moving on, and so we tried to get to the point, you know, can you give this talk, or can we publish this, or, you know, what permission do we need, or we try to make it succinct. And then if he wanted to visit a little longer, then we allowed that, but we tried not to push ourselves on him because he was always on to the next thing. He had miles to go, you know, before he slept. So it was always interesting. I do recall one rather humorous incident when we went to visit them. We were talking, and all of a sudden Phyllis looked at Hugh and she said, "Hugh, where did you get that tie?" And he looked down and looked a little sheepish, and he said, "Well, I pulled it out of the de-ice bag." She said, "I was trying to get rid of it." So he saw that there was more use in it and wanted to wear his tie.
Wow. Yeah, that says a lot. And I have found it refreshing as I've talked to you and Jack Welch and other people about Hugh Nibley's personal life at how much of a family man he was, because when you look at someone so prolific and brilliant, sometimes I assume that it must mean that's because they're just consumed by their work and that's all that matters to them. And that's kind of the ideal of the iconic academic today, that their work is their life. And so to see Hugh Nibley very personal and humanized, having 8 children and being so attached to Phyllis and having just a wonderful connection with the family and obviously the gospel of Jesus Christ, I've really found quite refreshing and beautiful.
I have to give a lot of credit to Phyllis. She was probably the perfect wife for Hugh. She did a lot of the child raising herself. But Hugh was also eager to get home and to be with the children. And he always welcomed the new family member, the latest family member, to come to the family, even giving them ice cream the day they brought them home from the hospital. So he loved his children. He'd take them on trips out to the wilderness, which he loved to do. So he was a family man, and we don't always see that through his writing.
One thing I'd love to hear from you is his work, One Eternal Round. You spent quite a bit of time in your chapter talking about that. Would you mind sharing what made that book so special to prepare?
This was an interesting book because for the last several years of his life, we always knew that the book was going to be called One Eternal Round. We didn't always know the titles of some of the other books in advance, but he was talking about the hypocephalus in The Pearl of Great Price. And he had his ways of approaching it, and this was just going to be his magnum opus, this One Eternal Round, his discussion of Abraham's life and what the hypocephalus might mean and so forth. And so it built on his Abraham in Egypt, on the message of the Joseph Smith papyri, But we also knew that it was going to be his last work. He had been promised that he would be able to complete his work before he passed on. And so we were always a little bit afraid to wrench it away from him, thinking, well, we don't want to cause his demise. Sure. And so he'd say, well, I have a chapter ready for you. And he'd be very excited about it. And honestly, I would take it and I said, well, thank you, Brother Nibley. And I'd file it away because I would know that in a week or two he would probably have another version of that chapter. So he was constantly working on it. Then came the point when he was unable to do as much. He wasn't able to get up to campus. And ultimately he was in a hospital bed in his living room, and that's where he was for a couple of years at the end. Occasionally he would call a meeting and he'd have some of us from farms come down and visit with him about the book, and he'd say, are you getting this? Like we were supposed to be writing what he was saying, and we're going, oh. He kept talking about the geometry involved in superimposing shapes on the hypocephalus. And since we couldn't clearly understand what he was trying to say, we'd say, well, have you written this down, Brother Nibley? He says, no, that's what you're here for. So we kind of thought, okay, whatever. So it was a very interesting process toward the end, because ultimately those of us working on the project realized that Brother Nibley was not going to finish the book, that somebody else would have to finish it. So on a day in February 2005, several of us were in the living room, and Hugh was there in body, but he was pretty much out of it, and we discussed, what are we going to be able to do to get this book out? Because it's so important. It's his life's and culmination of his life's work. We determined that somebody was going to have to be a co-author, which is different than all the other collected works where he was the single author. So we talked about, well, who could do it and who would do it. And Michael Rhodes went home that night, and I think he said that he stayed up most of the night worried about this, and he felt like he had to volunteer to be the co-author with Hugh Nibley to finish up this book. He knew that it would take years to complete it to everybody's satisfaction. He called me up. He said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be the co-author. And within, shall we say, an hour, I got word that Hugh Nibley had passed away. Wow. So the timing of it was incredible. I think he knew that it was going to happen. He could let go and we would move forward with it. So Michael Rhodes took 1,600 manuscript pages, got it down to 600. There was a lot of duplication and so forth, whittled it down, and he used source checkers. And at this point, they could use the internet. They did a lot of electronic source checking. So it was, by the time I finally got a manuscript to work on, it was in much better shape than some of the earlier ones were. But we all pushed and got it out for the celebration of his 100th birth, the centennial in 2010, so that we were pleased to complete the collected works at that point with this important volume, One Eternal Round.
And do you feel the final product was representative of what Hugh would have wanted?
I think so. Oh, I must add that the images, the artwork, have added so much to the last volumes of the collected works, but particularly in the One Eternal Round. Michael Lyon was a most dedicated artist. He would research every detail to be able to get the right drawing to illustrate the concept that Nibley was trying to talk about. And he wanted to put so many more in, but he was also slow. He was artistic. And so I would have to put the brakes on. I'd say, Michael, we can't do another picture here. He says, well, it'll be in my book. So Michael was very knowledgeable about art in the ancient world, and his work added so much to the collected works, and particularly the last volume.
Well, I do think it's important. I mean, the facsimile number 2 is, one of the only pictures in the canon of Latter-day Saint scripture, and so how novel to have imagery as part of your scripture. And so it's wonderful and important that imagery was a very integral part of that book as well. So last question for you. How do you feel Hugh Nibley has impacted your life and your work?
That's a great question, Jasmine. As an individual, I felt very blessed to be able to interact with him and to just see his intellect in action. I never took a class from him. I didn't feel like I had time in my schedule to do that. But knowing that how much he had influenced my husband when he was a teenager, as he got into the world of the prophets, and knowing that that's probably one of the things that helped my husband go into the field that he did, was the impact of Hugh Nibley. So personally, I feel like I have been blessed to know of his intellect, but the bottom line is it's his testimony. His testimony of the gospel shines through. He quit writing for the scholarly journals because that was too easy to publish in them. He wanted to do something that would stand when he went to return to God and say, I've done something worthwhile. So he quit writing the scholarly articles for them, and he wrote things that were meaningful to the members of the church. And I trust that the members of the church will realize what a treasure they have in this collected works of Hugh Nibley.
Well, I think his legacy is really important, and we do feel it today. You talked about how your husband, Stephen Ricks, taught at BYU, and I feel blessed to be in some way part of that legacy and heir of that training, since I took classes from your husband and he learned from Hugh Nibley, and now I'm in a position where I'm trying to, share and disseminate some of those things as well. And so hopefully through Hugh Nibley Observed and through all the work that we're doing at Book of Mormon Central and the Interpreter Foundation, that we can propagate his legacy even further. Do you have any final thoughts?
There's one example that I want to share at the end of his testimony. Close to the end, where he was still mobile and so forth, he finally gave us permission to go upstairs to where he kept all his famous boxes of 3x5 cards and stacks of papers and so forth. And he actually gave us permission to take them. So we knew he was kind of closing down. At one point he said, I know what the purpose of life is. And one of the individuals said, well, Brother Nibley, can you share that with us? And he said, yes, it's to have joy. He says the glory of God is intelligence, and we'll have such great intelligence when we move on. And as we solve problems, we will experience such great joy. He said, I could go tomorrow. And it sounded like he was really looking forward to it because he'd had a near-death experience, and he knew that what was coming was going to be wonderful. So this life is for joy as well as the next. And that was Brother Nibley's testimony.
What hope, and what a bright mind, but also a fervent testimony of the Savior. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and memories working with Hugh Nibley. This has been wonderful. It's great to hear perspective from an editor instead of just a scholar.
Yes, well, thank you. I appreciate being able to be here.
Wonderful.